My joints creaked like old mining machinery. The two missing fingers on my left hand whimpered phantomly, a sure sign that the weather was about to turn bad. Who cared, though? Thanksgiving should be perfect, even if the sky decides to rain stone on Hibbing. I carefully made my way down the creaky stairs, trying not to wake anyone. Ridiculous, of course. No one in this house has woken up to my footsteps in a long time. Years of working at the quarry had accustomed me to moving quietly. You never know when the unstable rock will decide to collapse from the extra sound. The turkey was already ready to roast. I'd defrosted it yesterday and rubbed it with spices. 20 pounds of bird to feed the whole family. 4 children, 6 grandchildren, 2 daughters-in-law, 1 son-in-law. I had the menu figured out a week ago. Mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, cranberry sauce, green bean casserole, cornbread. Just the way it's supposed to be. At 7 o'clock, the aroma of baking turkey wafted through the house. I'd already made the pie dough and peeled the potatoes. Zeke came down first, sleepy, rumpled, and smelling distinctly of booze. "Ma, where do you keep the aspirin?" he mumbled, squinting against the light. "In the bathroom, in the locker, as always," I answered, keeping my eyes on the potatoes. He walked to the bathroom, came back with the pills and a glass of water, and sat at the table, silently watching me work. "Why don't you give me a hand?" I asked, nodding at the mountain of unpeeled vegetables. "Ma, my head hurts," he moaned, "and I don't know how to do all this. Women's work." I didn't say anything. I didn't want to ruin the day with a fight. Besides, Zeke had never been much of a kitchen helper. I raised him to be. Though he wasn't even my own son, a nephew, my sister Margaret's son. 3 of my 4 children were not born to me. But did it ever matter? I'd raised them as my own since Margaret died in a mine collapse 25 years ago. By 9 o'clock, Ruth appeared in the kitchen with her children, 17-year-old Emma and 13-year-old Cooper. "Mama, are we having breakfast?" Ruth asked, without even saying hello. "There's yogurt and fruit in the refrigerator," I said. "I'm busy with lunch." God, it's lunches again. Ruth rolled her eyes. "Emma, Cooper, grab some cereal. Grandma's cereal is as good as ever." I gritted my teeth and went on with my work. Ruth had been my headache since she'd come home from her divorce 2 years ago. The only one of the kids to have a college degree, a psychology degree. Likes to say she understands people, except she can't understand her mother. By noon, the house was filled with people. Pearl arrived with her husband Bert and their 2 grown daughters. Zeke had gone somewhere and returned with Lance, my only grandson, who actually visits me. Noah brought his arrogant wife Vanessa and their twins. The noise was unbearable. I was hiding in the kitchen, checking the food was ready. Pearl came in and looked at the stove with a critical eye. "Mom, did you oversalt the sauce again this year?" She scooped up the cranberry sauce with a spoon and grimaced. "I didn't oversalt it," I replied. "I added a little more spice than usual. Vanessa's on a diet, and she can't have spicy things." Pearl sighed. "I brought my sauce. Can I put it on the table?" Without waiting for an answer, she pulled a plastic container out of her bag. Inside was a bright red slurry that looked more like cough medicine than sauce. They piled in with a noisy crowd, loudly discussing some kind of soccer game. Zeke and Noah were arguing about bets. Pearl was talking about problems at the gas station. Ruth was on the phone. Only Lance caught my eye and smiled. "It looks great, Grandma." "Thanks, honey," I smiled back. Noah raised his glass. "Here's to Thanksgiving, and to a mom who still knows how to cook." Everyone raised their glasses. I took a sip of wine and started carving the turkey. My hands, accustomed to heavy tools, easily handled the knife. "Mom, do you remember that patch of land behind the house?" Pearl suddenly asked. "The one overlooking the abandoned quarry?" I nodded, arranging the meat on plates. Bert found out they want to buy it for development. If you sell it, you could make a nice profit. Why would I sell it? I asked. It's the last piece of land your father had left. Mom, Pearl sighed, as if explaining to a child. You need money more than you need a piece of vacant land. You could move to something smaller. This house is too big for you alone. I'm not alone, I countered. Zeke and Ruth and the kids live with me. Exactly, Noah said. You can't carry grown-up kids around forever. Sell the house, buy a smaller apartment, and split the rest between us. It's only fair. I looked at my son in surprise. Fair? To divide my house while I'm still alive? Mom, Ruth rolled her eyes. No one's saying you're dying. You just have to plan for the future. You're not getting any younger, you know. So, what are you suggesting? I put the knife down and looked at the kids. There's a new nursing home opening in Hibbing, Pearl said. You wouldn't be lonely. I laughed. You want to send me to a nursing home? Me? I'd send anybody else to a nursing home. Mother, don't be so stubborn. Ruth sighed. It's for your own good. We're worried. Since when do you care about my good? I felt my anger boiling over. I've spent 11 hours preparing this meal, and before you've even sat down to eat, you're dividing up my property. Suddenly, Cooper, Ruth's son, asked, Grandma, tell me again how you blew up the rocks. I smiled. The grandchildren loved my stories about working at the quarry. Well, it was dangerous work. You had to calculate exactly how much explosive to put down so that the rock would split properly without damaging machinery or people. Weren't you afraid? Emma asked. Of course I was afraid. Only fools aren't afraid when they're working with explosives. But I knew what I was doing. One day my crew and I were digging out a whole slope. We had to build a road through a hillside. The chief was in a hurry to finish before the frost. We laid charges at 20 points. Oh, God, Mother, Ruth interrupted me. Do you have to tell these horror stories at the table? The children are trying to eat. But I'm interested, Cooper objected. You're 13 years old, Ruth said. You should be interested in learning, not in explosions. Ruth's right, Mom, said Pearl. Those mining stories of yours, they're so vulgar. Not at the dinner table. I stopped talking. Again, the shame of my work. What I'd been doing all my life. What fed them and put a roof over their heads. Astrid, Vanessa, Noah's wife, spoke up, speaking directly to me for the first time. Why don't you tell me something, more subtle, like your travels? I stared at her in silence. Traveling? When did I ever travel? I was raising 4 kids by myself, working double shifts so they could go to a decent school and not feel like orphans. I never traveled, Vanessa, I finally answered. There wasn't time. Oh, she sounded fake surprised. I thought everyone your age had seen the world. After dessert, we all went into the living room. There was a soccer game on TV. The men were on the couch with beers. The women were discussing the latest gossip. The kids were on their phones. No one even remembered the mountain of dirty dishes in the kitchen. I quietly gathered the plates and began to wash. My hands ached from the work. My back was aching. But I was used to the pain. Miners don't complain. Half an hour later, the kitchen was shining clean, and the mountain of dishes turned into neat stacks in the cabinets. I looked around and sighed. This was not how I had envisioned my retired life. There were leftovers from dinner in the refrigerator. I pulled out a plate, put some cooled mashed potatoes, a piece of turkey, and poured gravy over it. Without even reheating, I started eating right standing at the sink. Why sit down at an empty table? I'd gotten used to eating on the go at the quarry. There were rarely any proper breaks. Grandma? I flinched and turned around. Lance was standing in the doorway. I'm sorry, honey. I didn't hear you come in. What are you doing? He nodded at my plate. Dinner, I shrugged. I didn't want to interrupt you guys watching the game. Lance frowned. Why are you eating cold? And why are you in the kitchen, alone? It's easier. I turned back to the sink. I didn't want him to see my eyes. I was ashamed, though I didn't know why. I'll get you a proper plate and heat up some food, Lance said firmly, and reached into the cupboard. No need, honey. I stopped him. I'm more used to this. Go watch soccer with the others. He looked at me questioningly, but he didn't argue. He just stood there, watching me eat the cold remains of the dinner I'd been making all day. I felt awkward under his gaze. Go, I nodded. Don't miss the best part because of the old woman. He hesitated for a second, but then nodded and walked out. I sighed heavily and finished my meager dinner. It's always like this. You cook a feast for them and end up picking up crumbs. I washed my plate and decided to go upstairs to my room. I just wanted to lie down and forget this day. But as I walked past the living room, I heard my name. Zeke and Noah's voices came from the hallway leading to the back porch. They were smoking there, taking advantage of the break in the match. How long does she have left? Zeke was saying. She can barely walk anymore, and that deafness of hers. Don't play dumb, Noah said. Mother's as strong as a rock. She could live another 20 years if she's lucky. We won't be lucky, Zeke chuckled. The house is falling apart, the land's sitting idle, and she's stubborn. Pearl's right. We should get a guardianship. You think it'll work? Noah sounded doubtful. What's the big deal? Let's say she's out of her mind. Have you seen her basement? There's a whole museum of rocks in there. Let's say she's delusional. Plus the whole Morgan disappearance thing. Remember when she was interrogated? Quiet, Noah hissed. Not in front of everyone. Come on, that was ages ago. I was 15. I can barely remember. The main thing is that we'll have a foundation. Ruth will help. She's a psychologist. She'll say the mother's insane, that's all. And then what? Noah asked. We sell the house, the land, split the money. We'll put the mother in a decent boarding house. Everyone will be better off. I froze in the shadows. They talked about me as if I were already dead, like I was a thing that could be rearranged or thrown away. The kids have decided it's time to get rid of their mother. When do we start? Noah asked. After the holidays, Zeke answered. We have to get the paperwork ready and talk to Ruth properly. She can help or hinder. She'll help, Noah said confidently. She wants her share more than anyone. With the divorce, she's broke. I retreated into the darkness of the hallway. So here's how it goes. My own kids are planning to declare me crazy and sell off everything I own, everything I'd worked my whole life for. Bitterness rose to my throat. I turned to go upstairs to my room and saw Lance. He was standing a few feet away from me, and I could tell by the look on his face that he'd heard everything too. Our eyes met. There was horror in his gaze. I put my finger to my lips, calling for silence. He nodded. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up with a heavy head. The house was quiet. Ruth and the kids had gone to a friend's house for the night, and Zeke was probably asleep in his room. The memory of last night's conversation, overheard in the hallway, brought a new wave of anger. So this was what they'd decided to do to their mother? Put her in a nursing home and divide her assets? My gaze fell on the basement door. I hadn't been down there in months. To the kids, my basement was just a storage area for old things, a place where I sometimes went to rummage through junk, as they called it. But to me, it was a sanctuary, a temple of memory and hope. I opened the door, fumbled for the light switch, and started carefully down the steep steps. The bulb under the ceiling gave off a dim light, but it was enough for me. I had a good idea of where things lay. The basement was divided into two parts. The far corner held the usual stuff: canned goods, old tools, boxes of Christmas decorations, but the bulk of the space was taken up by my treasures, racks of minerals collected over 40 years of working in the Masabi iron ore pits. My collection wasn't just a collection of beautiful stones. It was the story of a lifetime, recorded in crystals and nuggets. Each specimen had its own story, its own place and time. To the outsider's eye, it was just a pile of rocks, but I remembered each one. I walked over to a large cabinet, unlocked the lock with the key I always wore around my neck, and pulled out a small metal safe. It contained my greatest treasure, a diary in a shabby leather binding. I took it carefully and sat down in an old chair in the corner of the basement. I had started keeping a diary when I was 19, when I first came to work at the quarry. Back then, in the 70s, there were only a handful of female bombers. I was hired only because my sister Margaret was already working there, and the shift supervisor, Gordon Morgan, didn't mind getting another pretty girl to work at his site. But he quickly realized that I was there to work, not to flirt, and that I had a talent for blowing things up. I flipped through the first pages, where the uneven handwriting of a 19-year-old girl had written down notes about the work, about safety, about the composition of the soil. And here was the first find, a small amethyst crystal found in the crevice after the explosion. I remembered holding it in the palm of my hand, amazed by its perfect shape. That's when my obsession with minerals began. Over the years, the diary became not just a notebook, but a true catalog of my collection. I carefully recorded where and when each specimen was found, what minerals it contained, and under what conditions it was formed. And then, in the 80s, the diary acquired another purpose. It became my financial book. It all started with a chance meeting with a geologist from Duluth University. He came to the quarry to study rocks and noticed an unusual specimen of blue crystal, which I wore as a pendant. It turned out to be a rare aquamarine formed in an iron ore vein, a case almost unique. The geologist offered to buy it for the university collection. The amount, he said, struck me: 3 months' salary for a pebble the size of a fingernail. Then I realized for the first time that my pebbles could be not just beautiful trinkets, but real capital. I sold the aquamarine, but I didn't spend the money. Instead, on the advice of the same geologist, I invested it in shares of a local mining company. A new section appeared in my diary: entries on investments, stocks, dividends. I continued to find minerals. Some I kept in my collection, some I sold, and invested the money again. All secretly, without telling anyone, not even my husband, while he was alive. By the 90s, I was an experienced and respected bomber, with the nickname Queen of Iron Mountain. By then, I had 4 children on my hands: my own daughter Pearl, and 3 nephews I'd taken in after my sister died. My husband had died the year before, a mining accident. Money was always tight, but I hung on and continued to slowly invest small sums. In 97, there was an industrial injury. When laying the charge, there was a rock fall, and 2 fingers on my left hand were crushed. After that, I was no longer allowed to work in explosives, but was transferred as a dispatcher. The salary became less, but so did the risks. Besides, I started to receive small dividends from my investments. That's when I fixed up the basement. The kids were grown. They weren't interested in what their mother did in her spare time. And I found that my collection had long since outgrown the closet. Gradually, the basement became a real geological museum. Some of the specimens I'd bought at mineral fairs, but most I'd found on my own. I flipped through the pages of my diary, stopping to note the most valuable finds. Here's a tourmaline crystal of an unusual green-pink color, found in 2003. Here's a nugget of silver from an abandoned mine in the north of the county. And here is a record of my most precious find: a cluster of diamond crystals, discovered in 2010 in a vein which we uncovered in the expansion of the Eastern Quarry. I didn't sell that diamond. It was kept in a special showcase under lock and alarm. A gift from the earth, hidden in the depths for millions of years until we cracked its dungeon with a precisely timed explosion. At the end of the diary were the most recent entries accounts, stocks, investments. If the latest bank statements I'd received 6 months ago were to be believed, my fortune was approaching $3 million. And that's not counting the value of the collection, which a Chicago appraiser last year called priceless. My children had no idea that their out of her mind mother, whom they are so eager to put in a nursing home, is actually a multimillionaire. I didn't hide that money out of greed. I just didn't want them to grow up spoiled by wealth, not knowing the value of labor. I planned to tell them after they got on their feet, started their families, and then I saw how they'd grown up and decided to wait until they were worthy heirs. But they never were. I closed the journal and clutched it to my chest. How painful it is to realize that your own children, whom you raised and loved, see you as nothing more than a nuisance, a burden to get rid of. It brought to mind an incident from 5 years ago when I had just retired. I broke my leg slipping on the ice. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. When I returned home, I found Pearl had taken over my bedroom, explaining that it was more convenient to take care of me. I was moved to a small room on the first floor, next to the kitchen. At that time, I did not argue. My leg really hurt. It was hard to climb the stairs. But then, when I recovered, Pearl was in no hurry to give me the room back. Mom, you're more comfortable here, next to the kitchen, and the bathroom's closer. At your age, it's best not to take the stairs. So I stayed in the kitchen den, like a housekeeper in my own house. And then they started treating me like a servant. Ruth wouldn't clean up the dishes. Mom, I haven't finished my report yet. You're going to do it anyway. Zeke didn't help around the house. Women's work, I'm not good at it. Even Noah, who lived apart, acted like a hotel when he came to visit. When did it start? Gradually, imperceptibly. At first, I was just a mom who likes to cook and do the housework. Then I was a grandmother who's retired anyway, bored, needs something to do. And now I'm just an old wreck for them, and it's time to get rid of it. The creak of a floorboard brought me out of my reverie. I looked up and saw Lance standing at the bottom of the stairs. Grandma? He looked at me with concern. Are you okay? Yeah. I quickly wiped my eyes and hid the journal. Just going through some old stuff. Lance came down to the basement and looked around. His gaze lingered on the mineral racks. Wow, he said quietly. This is all yours? I nodded. I've been collecting all my life. It's amazing. He stepped closer to the display case of quartz specimens. Isn't that amethyst from North Carolina? We have a similar one at the university, but not as large. I looked at my grandson in surprise. Do you know about minerals? A little, he shrugged his shoulders. I'm studying to be a geologist. Didn't you tell me? No, I shook my head. I thought you'd be like your father, a construction worker. Lance grinned. Dad didn't like it, said it was useless, that it was a waste of college money. But I've always been drawn to rocks, to the earth. I looked at him with surprise and joy. Wow, among all my children and grandchildren, there is one who shares my passion. Can I see it? He asked, pointing to the shop windows. Sure, I got up from the chair. I'll show you everything. We spent the next hour looking at the samples. I told him where I'd found each stone, under what conditions it had formed. Lance asked intelligent, professional questions. His eyes burned with the same interest that had once led me into the depths of the earth. Finally, we reached the locked cabinet where the most valuable specimens were kept. What's in there? Lance asked. I hesitated. That part of the collection I'd never shown anyone. But something about Lance, His genuine interest, his respect for my work made me pull out the key. "These are my rarest finds," I said, opening the cabinet. "Things I don't flaunt." His eyes widened when I pulled out a special container with a diamond cluster in it. "Oh my God," he whispered. "I mean, that's impossible? Diamonds in an iron ore deposit?" "Impossible, but true," I smiled, enjoying his amazement. "I found it in 2010, a geologic anomaly." "It's worth a fortune." Lance gently handed the container back to me. "Did you show it to a specialist?" "Yeah, an appraiser from Chicago came by. He said it would be the centerpiece of any geological museum." Lance shook his head. "And you just keep it in the basement?" "Grandma, you're a millionaire." "It's not just the rocks," I ventured. "Lance, you're the only one in this family who really appreciates what I've done all my life. You deserve to know the truth." I walked back to the chair and pulled out my journal. I wasn't just collecting rocks. I was investing. Stocks, bonds, bank accounts, all in secret for over 40 years. No one in the family knows. But after yesterday, after what Dad and Uncle Noah said, Lance asked quietly. I nodded. "I can't think about anything else since last night," I admitted. 40 years I've worked for this family, raised them, fed them, clothed them, and now they think I'm a burden. What are you going to do?" I closed the journal and looked him in the eye. "I need your help, Lance. You're the only one I can trust. I don't want to get you in trouble, but I can't do this without help." "I'll help," he said without hesitation. "What do you need to do?" I smiled. For the first time in years, I felt that I wasn't alone, that there was at least one person in my family who saw me not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a human being. "First of all," I said, "we need to smuggle out the most valuable pieces of the collection, and I need to contact my old friend, Otis Lundquist. He'll help sell the minerals and cash out the investment." Lance nodded. "When do we start?" "Right now." I pulled an empty box from under my chair. "No one will notice if a few display cases are empty. They don't even look in here." And we got to work. It's been a week since Lance and I went into action. In those 7 days, I never doubted my decision for a minute. Every time Ruth spoke to me in a condescending tone, or Zeke demanded that I make him breakfast at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was only strengthened in my resolve. No more being a doormat for my own children. The first thing I did was start gathering paperwork, certificates of ownership, insurance, bank statements, anything that would come in handy. My plan required meticulous preparation. After all, it was one thing to dream of escape, and quite another to actually turn your life around at 67. I decided to start with the bank. For years, I had been receiving statements in the mail, but over the last couple of years, I began to notice that some letters weren't getting through. Now, I realized it was probably Pearl checking my correspondence. Luckily, I kept my most important documents in a safe in the basement. On Thursday, Lance offered to drive me to Duluth, supposedly to show me his campus. Perfect cover for a visit to the bank. "Grandma's going on a field trip to the university?" Ruth chuckled at breakfast. "Lance, are you sure she's up to it? She's been so forgetful lately." "I can handle it," I said. "I won't fall apart on one trip." "Mom, no offense," Ruth sighed. "I'm just worried. Yesterday you forgot to turn off the stove, and the day before yesterday you couldn't remember where you left your glasses." I didn't say anything. Letting her think I was losing my mind would only serve my plan. The forgotten stove and the glasses were my first ploy, and it seemed to work. Duluth greeted us with a chilly wind off Lake Superior. The cold air was chilling to the bone, but I felt unexpectedly invigorated. Lance and I left the car in the university parking lot and walked to downtown. The northern branch of the First National Bank was in an old red brick building. "Would you wait for me here?" I asked my grandson. It might take a while. Sure, he nodded. I'll go to the bookstore across the street and call me when you're done. Inside the bank smelled like polish and money. I walked up to the counter and asked to see the account manager. A young woman in a strict suit escorted me to a separate office. What can I do for you, Mrs. Turwick? She asked as she looked over my paperwork. I want to check on my accounts and stocks, I replied. I haven't gotten a statement in 6 months. She tapped on the keyboard and then looked at me in surprise. You have several accounts and an investment portfolio. Do you need information on all the positions? Yes, I nodded, and especially on the shares of Masabi Mining. The woman printed out several pages and handed them to me. Here you are. As you can see, your investments have shown significant growth, especially Masabi Mining's shares. After the merger with the Canadian company last year, they almost tripled in value. I looked at the numbers and felt dizzy. $4,326,000. My modest investment had grown to an amount I couldn't even imagine. I want to change the way I get my statements, I said, getting over my excitement, and check to see who has access to my accounts. It turned out that 3 years ago, someone had executed a power of attorney to manage my accounts in Pearl's name. It was my signature, but I knew for a fact I never signed it. I want to revoke that power of attorney, I said firmly, and get a new card. I think I lost my old one. The bank manager helped me with the documents. Within an hour, I had a new card, a revoked power of attorney, and full control over my accounts. I also arranged to transfer most of the funds to a new account at another bank, which I plan to open in the next few days. Walking out of the bank, I took a deep breath of cold air. So Pearl had forged my signature. I wondered how much money she'd already withdrawn. There were some strange transfers on the statements that I didn't remember. Well, that doesn't matter now. What mattered was that the principal was intact, and she'd be safe soon. Lance was waiting for me at a coffee shop nearby. How did it go? He asked, sliding me a cup of hot tea. Better than I expected, I smiled. Otis Lundquist lived in a small house on the outskirts of Eveleth, 20 miles from Hibbing. He and I had worked together for almost 30 years. He was the best bomber on the entire Iron Range and the only man I trusted unconditionally. Otis's cabin stood at the edge of the pine forest. An old pickup truck was parked in the yard, hence the homeowner. I asked Lance to wait in the car. The old man's a little paranoid, I explained. He doesn't like strangers. Otis opened the door without waiting for me to knock. He always had a sixth sense for when people were approaching, a professional habit for a man who'd worked with explosives. Despite his 78 years, Otis looked strong and trim. Only deep wrinkles and completely gray hair gave away his age. I need some advice from an old bomber, I said. May I come in? He stepped aside to let me inside. The house smelled of tobacco and machine oil. Parts of some kind of mechanism were spread out on the table. Still messing around with time bombs? I grinned. It's an alarm clock, he muttered. Sit down and tell me. I told him everything about the kids' plans to put me in a nursing home, about my millions, about my decision to disappear. Otis listened without interrupting, but he frowned harder and harder. So you want to blow up the bridges? He asked me when I was done. I understand that. We talked for over an hour. Otis asked precise, specific questions. How to cash out without a trace. How to sell the house without the kids getting involved. How to make the disappearance look natural. The main thing is to make sure they don't get suspicious before they do, he said toward the end. They need to think you're a helpless old woman. Play on that. Let them underestimate you. That's your advantage. He also promised to help with the mineral sales. He had connections among collectors who didn't ask too many questions. Only take out the most valuable specimens in advance, he advised. And keep the documents ready. When you start acting, there will be no time for hesitation. As I drove back to Hibbing, I felt a strange calmness. The plan was taking shape. Otis was right. The key to success was to keep the kids thinking I was weak and helpless. At home, we were in for an unpleasant surprise. Ruth started a general cleaning and took out several boxes of junk from the pantry to the dumpster. Among the discarded items were mineral specimens that I had temporarily stored there before moving them to the basement. Mom, what do you need those rocks for? Ruth rolled her eyes when I started to get indignant. They're just dust. I freed up your shelves for normal things. They're my rocks, I said through gritted teeth. I collected them. That's why we're worried, she sighed. This collecting mania. Dr. Harris says it could be a sign of dementia. I almost choked with indignation. Dr. Harris who? I don't know any Dr. Harris. Of course you don't, Ruth said patiently. We consulted him about your condition. He's a specialist in age-related mental changes. At that moment, I realized that they had gone further than I thought. They're already preparing the ground for a declaration of incompetence. Well, it's all the more important to act quickly. Over the weekend, Zeke suddenly announced that I needed to give him my credit card. Ma, you missed another payment, he said over dinner. Let me keep an eye on your finances so you don't have this problem. What payments? I was surprised. The house insurance, he sighed. It was 2 months late. I had to pay it out of my own money. I knew for a fact that all the payments were set up for automatic debit, but I decided not to argue, let him think I was out of my mind. The card's in my wallet, I said, only I don't remember the PIN number. It's okay, we'll get it back. Zeke nodded and then went through my bag. He couldn't have known he was taking an invalid card, of course. The new one was in a hidden pocket of my old work overalls that no one had ever touched. The next day, I discovered that my cell phone was missing. Ruth nonchalantly informed me that she had taken it in for repair. It was malfunctioning, Mom. You need a reliable phone in case something happens. Actually, there was nothing wrong with the phone. They just wanted to control my communications. Well, it's good for them to think I'm cut off from the world. In the meantime, Lance and I kept things going. Twice a week he came to visit his grandmother, but in reality, he came to move out another shipment of minerals. We put them in special containers and took them to a rented garage in a neighboring town for storage. Otis helped us reach out to an anonymous online auction site for collectors. Lance, as a geology student, described the lots with scientific accuracy. The first sales had already brought in almost $100,000 in cash. I kept the money in a new safe, installed in a cache in an abandoned guardhouse at the old quarry. This piece of land was technically owned by the company, but in fact it had been forgotten. I had bought the cabin 15 years ago through a front man and had been slowly fixing it up. Now it became my refuge and my staging area. At the same time, I was reinforcing the legend of my incipient dementia. I began to forget where I put things, confused the names of my grandchildren, sometimes pretended not to understand simple questions. Once I even went outside in my nightgown, causing quite a stir in the family. See? Ruth said to the others. I told you she wasn't all right. Zeke and Noah shook their heads with feigned sadness, and Pearl was already openly discussing what furniture she was going to take from my house. It was a huge effort not to tell them what I thought, but I remembered Otis's advice to let them underestimate me. In the evenings, when everyone had gone to their rooms, I crept quietly into the basement and worked on my plan. I studied maps of the area, laid out routes, made lists of things I would need. Just like the good old days when I was planning a particularly elaborate explosion. One day, Ruth caught me looking at a map of Michigan. Mom, what are you doing? She asked suspiciously. Huh? I made a confused face. I just, I think I was here. Or have I? You've never been to Michigan, she sighed. You think you have. I guess, I mumbled. I don't understand anything anymore. She shook her head and walked away, and I allowed myself a slight smile. Michigan was where I planned to start my new life, in a small town by the lake. I'd already looked at a house through a realtor who worked with Otis. By the end of the month, almost the entire collection had been moved out of the basement. The most valuable pieces sold, the rest safely stashed away. I opened new accounts at 3 different banks under my real name. Another account was opened in the name of Elma Carlson, my new identity. An old friend of Otis's helped me get a passport in that name. Expensive, but safe. I knew it wasn't legal, but I didn't see any other way. My kids left me no choice. The main one was selling the house. I secretly contacted the real estate company where Vanessa, Noah's wife, worked. They had long wanted to buy a lot to build a shopping center, and my house and the surrounding land was perfect for them. They bypassed Vanessa through her boss. I signed all the documents in Duluth, stating in the contract that I would vacate the house in 2 months. The money had already been deposited into my new account. Now the hardest part was the final confrontation. I knew the kids wouldn't just let me go. They wanted my property, my money. But they didn't want me. I knew this day would come. All preparations were made. My treasures were safely hidden. Accounts were transferred. Documents were prepared. Like an experienced bomber, I planted the charges in the right places and laid the detonation cord. All that remained was to press the button. The morning was cold and cloudy. Heavy clouds covered the sky, promising snow the first of the season. I stood at the kitchen window, looking at the gray landscape, and thought about how much my life would change in the next few hours. There was no doubt just a slight thrill, that special thrill I remembered from my quarry. The moment before the explosion, when everything freezes in anticipation. The family meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Pearl had called everyone yesterday, letting them know they needed to discuss Mom's future. I grinned, remembering her caring tone. What a caring tone! They just wanted to get rid of the burden and divide up my possessions. By 2:30, we started to pack. Pearl and her husband Bert were the first to arrive. She had brought some papers in a leather folder and looked unusually serious and focused. Her eyes roamed the room, assessing the furniture she already mentally considered her own. Ruth was already home. She was living with me, along with the kids. Emma and Cooper were thankfully at school. They didn't need to see this family embarrassment. Zeke wasn't going anywhere either. He was on the couch hung over until noon, then took a long shower to make himself presentable. Noah and Vanessa were the last to arrive, 15 minutes late and not apologizing. Vanessa immediately started looking around, like she was looking for signs of my supposed dementia, which she had undoubtedly heard about. I noticed that Lance was gone, and that was a good thing. We agreed that he'd come over later, when things had already happened. He didn't need to see the family execution I was preparing. Everyone settled into the living room. Pearl took a seat at the head of the table, my usual place. I noted this small but telling detail. She already saw herself as mistress of the house. She had a look of fake concern on her face, the caring daughter mask that looked so convincing in her social media photos, but didn't match her true intentions. So, Pearl began, opening the file folder. We were gathered to discuss Mom's condition and make decisions about her future. I sat quietly in the corner, pretending not to understand what was happening. Over the past weeks, I had gotten so into the role of the senile old woman out of my mind that the kids had completely bought into the legend. They looked right through me, talking about me in the third person, as if I were an inanimate object. Pearl went on at length about my supposed memory problems, the strange things I supposedly did. The kettle in the pot was her favorite example. The children nodded in agreement, exchanging understanding glances. I watched from my corner, noting the details of their behavior. The way Zeke kept glancing at his watch, as if he had more important things to do. The way Ruth assumed a professional psychological look, the way Noah drummed his fingers nervously on the table, obviously wanting to get the formalities over with and move on to the division of property. "There's a new boarding house for the elderly in Hibbing," Pearl announced, pulling out a glossy brochure. "Pine Hills. It's a very decent place. They're willing to take Mom anytime." "How much will it cost?" Zeke asked immediately, without even looking at the brochure. Pearl gave a figure that made Zeke squeal, but she immediately reassured him, explaining that the cost would be covered by the sale of the house and land. That, however, would require a guardianship. As I listened to their cynical calculations, I could feel a heavy, cold calm building up inside. It was like the state before a complex explosion, when you know that there is no margin for error and people's lives depend on your actions. Only now I was not going to save lives, but to destroy illusions. "I've already prepared a deed of gift for the house." Pearl pulled out another document, waving it triumphantly. "If Mom signs it now, we can avoid a long legal process." "Will she sign it?" Noah asked hesitantly, giving me a leering look. "She will," Pearl said. "She's out of her mind. We'll say it's insurance or something." Their cavalier attitude was almost delightful. I listened to them plan to trick me as if I were an unreasonable child, and a determination grew within me to teach them a lesson that would be remembered forever. Pearl walked over to me with a fake smile and held out the document. "Mom, we need you to sign this paper. It's for your own safety." I took the sheets and began to act out the last act of my comedy. I mumbled something inaudible, squinting, pretending I didn't understand what I was reading. Pearl patiently explained that it was just insurance, holding out a pen to me. Her eyes were impatient. She could barely contain herself from grabbing my hand and signing for me. And then I felt something inside me click, like a detonator setting off a chain reaction. It was time to start my speech. I raised my eyes and looked at Pearl, not in a hazy way, but with a sharp, clear gaze. "No." One short word spoken in a firm voice changed the atmosphere in the room. I could see Pearl's confusion, and I could see the confusion in the children froze with open mouths, stunned by the sudden change. "Pearl," I looked directly at my oldest daughter. "I know about the forged power of attorney. I know about the $22,000 you've stolen from my account over the last 2 years." Her face turned white, her eyes widened. She tried to say something, but I stopped her with a gesture. "Don't bother making excuses. I checked all the transactions, Bert's new car, the Florida vacation, all with my money you stole." I looked from one face to the next, methodically picking each one apart. "Zeke, I paid for your alcohol treatment, twice, covered your bookie debts, foreclosed on your car, and that's just in the last 5 years. And you haven't even bothered to clean your plate once." Zeke stared at the floor, not daring to look up. "Noah," I turned to him, "remember when I worked double shifts to pay for your college? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Only when I needed money." Ruth looked at me with a mixture of horror and disbelief, clearly not recognizing her out-of-her-mind mother in this adamant woman with the piercing gaze. "And you, psychologist," I grinned bitterly. "Those pebbles you threw away 2 weeks ago were worth $60,000, each one." Ruth's eyes flashed with something akin to realization of the magnitude of her mistake, but it was too late. I walked over to the sideboard and pulled out a thick file folder, tossing it on the table. "Here's the deed to this house. I sold it 3 weeks ago." It was as if a bomb had exploded in the room. Pearl jumped up and grabbed the documents, frantically flipping through them, looking for a catch. Ruth froze with an expression of utter incomprehension, and Zeke muttered a swear word, sliding lower in his chair. "The new owner is Northwood Development," I continued in a steady voice. They're going to tear down the house and build a shopping center here. You have 2 weeks to move out. Northwood? Vanessa mumbled. There was a look of recognition in her eyes. Yes, I smiled at her. The company where you work. Your boss, Mr. Johnson, personally helped me with the deal. Of course, he didn't tell you. I asked him to keep it a secret. Noah looked at his wife with incomprehension and incipient suspicion. It was interesting to watch not only their plans, but also their trust in each other crumble. My mineral collection was sold to the Minnesota Geological Museum and to private collectors. I continued my methodical narrative. The proceeds totaled over $2 million. Their eyes widened as they realized what I had said. $2 million for some basement rocks? And Misabi mining stock? Remember how you laughed at my pointless investment? 4,326,000, already cashed out. I watched the emotions on their faces change from shock and disbelief to avid interest. Surely, now that it was revealed that I was a millionaire, their attitudes should change. But it was too late. And you know what? I paused dramatically. Neither one of you is getting a dime. There was a heavy silence in the room. They looked at me with horror, unable to believe that their dutiful mother, whom they thought helpless and feeble-minded, was capable of such a crushing blow. I learned the most important thing in my career, I said, looking at their shocked faces. The proper way to plant explosives, find the weak points in the rock and exploit them. I started walking around the room, feeling a surge of energy. This was my stage, my big moment. Years of humiliation and neglect were now paying off 100-fold. I placed the charges in exactly the right places, I continued, watching their reactions with amusement. Boom! I clapped my hands together, making everyone flinch. Pearl loses access to my money and the opportunity to take over the house. Another clap. Boom! Zeke loses the roof over his head and the source of funding for his drinking and betting. Clap. Boom! Noah learns that his wife works for the company that will tear down his childhood home. Final clap. Boom! Ruth and her kids end up on the street. No support, no money, no prospects. I waved my hands like a magician completing a trick. The explosion is complete. The rock has been crushed. Now we can start excavation. Except there won't be any excavation. There's nothing to extract from these ruins. They sat stunned by my words. Their faces showed incomprehension, shock, denial. Pearl tried to object at one point, but the words stuck in her throat. Ruth looked at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. Noah sat stony-faced, and Zeke burst into a sudden nervous laugh, cut off immediately by the stern stares of the others. I headed for the exit, feeling unprecedentedly light. It was like years of weight had fallen from my shoulders. You have 2 weeks to find a new place to live, I said over my shoulder. Then the builders will be here. And you? Noah's voice came to me. Where are you going to live? I turned around in the doorway, giving them one last look. Don't worry about me. I've got everything covered, which is more than I can say for you. After the family council, I quickly went up to my room and locked the door. There was shouting from downstairs. My kids had finally realized what had happened and were fighting. Pearl was accusing Vanessa of colluding with me. Noah was defending his wife. Zeke was swearing at everyone, and Ruth just seemed to be crying. Usually these sounds hurt me, but now I felt only cold satisfaction. The first phase of the plan had succeeded. Now it was necessary to complete the operation. From under the bed, I pulled out a small travel bag, already packed for the escape. It contained the most necessary things: documents in the name of Elma Carlson and $10,000 in cash, enough for the first time. The rest of the money was waiting for me in my new accounts and in a stash in the guardhouse. I wrote a short note for Lance, just one line: Cabin 3, Route 73, blue mailbox. He'd understand. It was the coordinates for our secret meeting place, an old hunting cabin in the woods, 30 miles from Hibbing. We'd agreed that after I disappeared, Lance would check that mailbox once a month, where I'd leave instructions for him. Folding the note, I quietly stepped out into the hallway. The shouting downstairs continued. No one noticed me slip into Lance's room and leave the note under his pillow. Then I went back to my room and started waiting for the right moment. Near midnight, the house finally quieted down. Ruth took the crying children to her room. Zeke went to the bar to pour out his grief. Pearl and her husband left for the hotel, and Noah and Vanessa departed with a loud slam of the door. I knew I had a few hours before anyone came back. Picking up my bag, I carefully made my way down the stairs. The steps creaked treacherously, but the house was empty, so I didn't have to worry about anyone hearing. I took one last look around the living room, the place of so many family quarrels and rare moments of happiness. Nothing tied me to these walls. The house had long ago ceased to be my sanctuary, turning into a cage where I was a servant to my own children. I walked out the back door, shutting it quietly behind me. The night was dark, but I knew every stone on the path leading to the abandoned quarry. How many times I'd walked here when I was young, coming back from my shift. The guardhouse looked abandoned, just the way I'd tried to keep it. The shingled roof, the peeling paint, the boarded-up windows. No one would have thought there was a well-equipped hideout inside. I pulled out the key hidden under a rock and unlocked the heavy padlock. It was dark and cool inside. I turned on the flashlight and looked around. Everything was intact. Food supplies, water canisters, a portable generator. In the corner was a safe with cash and the most valuable mineral specimens I hadn't had time to sell. After changing into warm clothes, I turned off the flashlight and left the cabin. The lock clicked one last time. I wasn't coming back here. Everything I needed had been packed and taken out beforehand. Otis's used pickup truck was waiting for me on an old forest road a half-mile from the cabin. Not too conspicuous, but reliable. Inside was a folder with a route, maps, and addresses of places where I could safely stop. Otis had thought of everything. The old bomber knew how to cover his tracks. I started the engine and slowly pulled away. I was heading north, toward Michigan, toward a new life. Behind me was Hibbing, the town where I had spent 67 years of my life. The town where I had worked, loved, raised my children. The city that had now become a cage. Grand Marais, a small town on the shores of Lake Superior, greeted me on a foggy morning. I'd chosen it for a reason. Far enough away from Hibbing that I wouldn't run into people I knew, but not so far that Lance would have trouble getting there. Plus, an old friend of Otis, a retired local sheriff, lived here, who helped with the paperwork and didn't ask too many questions. The house I'd bought in advance stood on the outskirts of town, 100 yards from the lake shore. It was small but sturdy, with a veranda overlooking the water. I had gotten it from an elderly couple who had moved to Florida. They were happy to get a quick deal for cash. The neighbors appeared friendly, but not intrusive. Just what I needed. There was a young couple with a young child living on the left, and an artist on the right who spent most of his time plein air painting by the lake. No one asked too many questions about my past. A week after moving in, I decided to check out what was going on in Hibbing. Otis's old police buddy reported that my family didn't raise the alarm until the third day after my disappearance. Zeke came home hungover and discovered I hadn't made breakfast. Looking in my room, he found it empty and assumed I had run away, unable to handle the confrontation. The police began a search, but without much enthusiasm. After all, I was an adult who had left voluntarily. Otis told me that Pearl and Noah blamed each other for my disappearance, and Ruth had had a nervous breakdown. They didn't believe until the last minute that I had really sold the house, until the company representatives came demanding that I vacate the premises. I followed the news from afar, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. After all, these people had been my family for almost half a century. I'd raised them, loved them, sacrificed everything for them. And that's how it ended, with mutual accusations and frantic attempts to salvage something from their crumbling lives. A month after my disappearance, the lawyer I had hired in advance sent my children official documents. They said that in the event of my death or disappearance, each of them would be entitled to $5,000 for funeral or memorial services. Nothing else. No house, no land, no stocks, no insurance. Everything else, according to the documents, was spent on charity and geologic research. Otis said Pearl nearly trashed the lawyer's office, demanding to see the full will. But there was nothing in it but this meager handout. The rest of my millions were gone, transferred to Elma Carlson's accounts in various Midwestern banks. Life in Grand Marais was exactly what I'd dreamed of. Quiet, measured, full of small pleasures. I started a small garden, walked along the lake in the mornings, and read books on the porch in the evenings. No one required me to cook dinner for 12 people. No one left dirty dishes in the sink. No one spoke to me in a condescending tone. Lance visited me for the first time 2 months after I moved in. He found my note in the mailbox outside the hunting lodge and drove to the address. I barely recognized him. He had grown a beard and dyed his hair dark to look less like himself. We sat on the veranda, looking out at the setting sun coloring the lake red. "How are they?" I asked, even though I knew most of the answer from Otis. "Not good," Lance answered honestly. "Dad's been drinking more than usual. He says you've ruined the family. Pearl's mad at the world. Uncle Noah and Vanessa were almost divorced, but then they made up. It seems she really didn't know about the sale of the house. Aunt Ruth and the kids are staying with a friend in a studio apartment. Emma had dropped out of high school and taken a job as a waitress. I listened, feeling a strange emptiness inside. Not joy at their suffering, but not regret either. More like acceptance of the inevitable, like a geologist accepting that after an explosion, the rock will never be the same again. "What about you?" I asked, noticing the shadows under his eyes. "I'm fine," he shrugged. "Transferred to Michigan Tech, closer to you and away from them. I had to take out student loans, though." I shook my head. I stood up and went into the house and came back with a checkbook. I wrote a check for $50,000 and handed it to Lance. "For education and living expenses. You're the only one who ever saw me as a person, not a servant or a purse." He didn't want to take it for a long time, but I insisted. After all, that's what the money was for, to help those who really deserved it. We agreed that he would come once every 2 months, not more often, too risky. The family was still hoping to find me, especially Pearl. She was sure there were millions hidden somewhere, and she wasn't about to give up the search. In the spring, I took up gardening. I planted flower beds in front of the house, planted vegetables in the small plot behind the house. My hands, accustomed to the heavy tools of a bomber, now gently transplanted fragile sprouts. It felt strange and right at the same time, as if life itself was taking on a new form. Lance came every 2 months, as we'd agreed. He became my window to my past life, to Hibbing, to my former children. He told me that Pearl had finally come to terms with losing her home and moved to Duluth, where she opened a small store. Zeke got a construction job in the Twin Cities, but he couldn't hold it for long. Alcohol problems again. Ruth slowly came to her senses, found a job as a school counselor in a small town near Hibbing. Noah and Vanessa moved to Chicago, away from the family drama. I was less and less interested in the news. They became like stories from a book I had already read and put aside. My new life was filling up with its own events, getting to know the local garden club, volunteering at the library, taking long walks along the lakeshore. Time passed. I was getting used to a new name, a new life. Sometimes I woke up at night thinking I could hear the voices of children calling me, but they were only dreams, memories of a past I had left behind.